Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve's deferred assets. Now, the deferred assets is when the Federal Reserve is operating in the red. Typically, the Fed would be operating in the black, where they turn a profit, and that profit is then given back to the Treasury in the form of what they call a remittance. So when the Federal Reserve is doing their thing all year long, they have an operational cost, services that they provide, interest that they collect off of the treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and the rest of their balance sheet. These are the things that then gives the Federal Reserve the ability to either have a profit or a loss. When they have a profit, again, that is the remittance that goes back to the Treasury, and the Treasury typically would use that to then lower the deficit. Right. And it's not a lot. I mean, I guess it's a lot when you think about it, but it's not a lot in today's numbers. If I remember right, like it would be around $100 billion or so that the Federal Reserve would give back to the Treasury, depending on, that year and, how much operational costs and interest rates that they had collected. So the Fed in their typical operation would then have this profit to it. But when it doesn't have a profit and it's operating in the loss, it's called deferred assets, which I find a very interesting term. Deferred asset. It sounds like a deferred debt, right? So when the Federal Reserve doesn't have enough money coming in order to pay out all its interest payments on its accounts that people hold with them and their operational cost, then they have to go into what they call a deferred asset. And that's when they, from what I can gather, literally print up money out of thin air. There is no real asset that they are holding. It's a promise that eventually it will be paid back, and then the remittance can start again to the Treasury. So now I find it a very interesting thing to call a deferred asset, and who actually holds this deferred asset, and what happens when the deferred asset grows or never goes away. See, now typically what you hear is that when the Federal Reserve goes back into operating in normal times again, that all this will go away and things will go back to what is considered normal. But this is going to take years, literally years, to happen. And now the idea is that the Federal Reserve is going to have to lower interest rates in order to return to a time in which that this remittance can continue back to the Treasury. See, the Federal Reserve is operating at a loss because of the high interest rates that it's paying out at the repo facility and the reserves or the excess reserves that the big banks hold at the Federal Reserve. So now, typically, the way the Federal Reserve had conducted itself as far as their interest rate setting policy is that they would hold a certain amount of reserves at the big banks, or they would have a certain amount of reserves being held at the big banks. And that was called a limited reserve system. So at the end of the day, some of these banks would have excess reserves and some of them would be in need of reserves. The ones who had excess reserves would lend them to the ones who were in need of reserves, and that overnight lending rate was the effective fund rate. So when the Federal Reserve was trying to establish a particular interest rate, they would buy and sell reserves or treasuries off of these big banks, adjusting the level of reserves that they would have, and this limited reserve system with an overnight lending rate would then have the effective fund rate landing within the Fed's target. I know that's really complicated to try and wrap your head around, but it gets worse than this. The Fed has then gone into what they refer to as an ample reserve system, right, or an abundant reserve system. So when the quantitative easing had fired up and they were printing up all this money and they loaded up these big banks with an abundant reserve and then dropped the reserve requirement to zero, these big banks had excess reserves. All of them did. And they had nobody to lend them to. And so what the Fed had done is set up the repo facility and the account on excess reserves. So there was a place for these big banks to park their money. And there was other places like the money markets and other facilities who could also use these facilities or the repo facility to pretty much put all the excess reserves, all this extra money that the Federal Reserve had printed up during the quantitative easing. So the interest on excess reserves in the repo facility is how the Federal Reserve was able to channel interest rates. The only problem with this is that the interest rates that they are paying out at these facilities is now more than what they are taking in on their balance sheet of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. So let me explain that again. The Federal Reserve has a balance sheet of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities and some other assets. These assets pay the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then takes that money and pays out excess reserves and repo facility interest rates. Okay. The amount that they're paying out at those two facilities is more than what they are taking in. So now they are operating at a loss. And this loss is now referred to as the deferred asset. And they plan on operating this way for years until the next downturn, or so they say the next downturn. And when that happens, then the interest rates can come down. The amount of that the Federal Reserve is taking in would then be enough to pay out the interest rates that are then lower at these facilities, or however the accounts are set up at the time. Right? So that's kind of the idea behind it, is that once the interest rates lower, the Federal Reserve would then be able to afford the payments that are going out, as opposed to the payments that are coming in on their balance sheet of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. And this would then be able to pay back the deferred asset and eventually put them in a position in which that they can now give the remittance back to the treasury. Now, I know this is all really complicated, but stick with me for just a second, because I have a different theory on what's going to end up taking place, in which that the Federal Reserve can keep interest rates elevated and start operating back in the black again. So now the idea behind keeping interest rates elevated is to combat inflation. Right? And if inflation is running rampant and continues to run rampant, they will not be able to lower their interest rates, making it very difficult for them to continue to pay out their bills and not have a deferred asset, right? Which is them deferring their debt, really, right? So now, if they have this elevated interest rate and they have this operational cost that exceeds what their income is, they are going to find themselves ever increasing amounts of deferred asset eventually going bankrupt. However, we're in quantitative tightening. And quantitative tightening is pulling money out of the system. Now, if this continues for long enough, what you're going to find is the need for the repo facility and the account on excess reserves to not be as needed. And you will find that there is such a limited amount of money in the system that we actually go back to a limited reserve system, in which that the overnight lending rate at these big banks will then be where the Federal Reserve establishes the Fed funds, the effective fund rate, no longer needing to be paying out at the repo facility or the excess reserves, leaving them the ability to have an income on their balance sheet of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, whatever left at the time. All this while maintaining the elevated interest rates to combat inflation. You see how this all goes down? See, the idea, even Joseph Wang, who I think is probably one of the smartest guys when it comes to interest rates and the Federal Reserve and their monetary setting policies, he says in an article that he wrote, I think it was about a year ago about this, he even makes that statement: when the Federal Reserve goes to combat the next downturn and the interest rates come down, that it would fix the problem, or not necessarily fix the problem, but they would be able to operate back in the black again, and therefore pay back that deferred asset and then begin to provide the remittance back to the Treasury. But that was off the idea that the interest rates came down. I'm believing that the interest rates will stay elevated, and the fact that they shrink the monetary supply to the point that we go back to a limited reserve system within the banking and finance, and that these big banks on an overnight lending rate will then reestablish the effective fund rate back there. Right, not at the Fed and the repo facility and the interest on excess reserves, but the overnight lending rate at the big banks. That's what I think is going to happen. All right, uneducated economist, you let me know.